go.
And what's the difference between when you're writing and when you're editing? What's your day like when you're editing? Because that's a different
Totally
ballgame.
different. Totally different. What I do when I edit is I go back. Well, my writing day is I write to a certain point. The next day I go back about 4 or 5 pages, and I start about 4 or 5 pages back from that prior day so that I can get a feel of where I was. And so inevitably I'm editing those 4 or 5 pages before I then get started on creating new scenes, new chapters again, and then I'll go from there. But when I am clearly just editing, I go back to page 1. And I just start going through it, and I look for all those things that I talk about in my classes that you need to get rid of. You know, all the opinions, all the backstory, all the flashbacks, all the things that don't move the story forward, the unnecessary narration, the unnecessary scenes, and I just start doing, you know, cutting, massive cutting. When I'm writing in the creative process, I keep a notebook, or I have 2 screens, and I'll actually keep a second page, and I'll make notes as I go. And I'll know certain things like, you have to give her a gun, you know, or something like that. So that when I'm going back through then that editing process, I have those notes in front of me. And so I'm going through that first time through, and I'm doing a macro edit. I mean, I'm cutting scenes, I'm moving things around, I'm getting rid of duplicative portions of the book, and I'm doing all the macro stuff to make the story work. And then when I'm done with that process, whether it's 3, 4 days, whatever, then I start and I go back and I really start editing on a more minute level. And that's a process that I have that's really a checklist that I teach and talk about. Double actions that aren't necessary, things that can be presumed by the reader that you don't need to say, gerunds instead of, you know, hard-hitting verbs, too many adjectives, dialogue that's stilted, you know, all those things. And then I go through and I do that. And the final edit really is the polishing edit. And almost invariably that needs to be done on paper. And I don't always get an opportunity to do that before the book will go to the editor. I know a lot of times I do that in the editing process then with my editor. When they give me the manuscript, I'll start doing the line edits. And so, you know, that sometimes drives them crazy. But I think you need to do at least 1 edit on paper, because your book doesn't read the same on paper as it does on screen.
That's true. How long do you take normally to flesh out an idea and get all the way through your first draft?
A long time. You know, the idea for me is really the hard part. And it's because I start with these massive ideas. You know, I start with these ideas where David Sloan's going to take on the Russian mafia, and then I realize I don't write those kind of books. I write personal books. And so what it turns out is a mother loses her daughter to a drug overdose and comes to David Sloan and says, "I need your help. You know, I'm going to write a book about the Iraq War." No, I'm not. I'm going to write a book about a woman who lost her husband, who was in the National Guard, and she can't find out why, and so she goes to David Sloan. The book that I'm working on currently is about a Seattle homicide detective, female, whose sister died mysteriously 20 years earlier. It's not a book about, you know, some grand idea. It's a book about relationships. It's a book about a very personal story. And so once I get the idea, then I have to convince myself that I can make a big book out of a small idea. You know, the relationship of 2 sisters, the relationship of a father and a son, the relationship of a man and a woman. And once I do that, then I'm very fast. Then the story comes to me very quickly. And I've written books in 6 weeks. But I have to go through that process, and I don't get frustrated anymore because I know it's just me going through that process now. It can drive my agent crazy because I'll be sending her all these ideas and she'll be saying no, 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 and she's right, because they're not the kind of books I write. And I have to be comfortable that those are the kind of books I write. But as a young writer, I made the mistake of that believing, you know, you have to have a high concept idea, but not understanding what high concept means. You know, you're thinking high concept means, you know, it has to be the President of the United States who's in trouble, or it has to be a senator who's in trouble. And of course the problem with that is you begin to stretch credibility. It's much more plausible to have a sister who's been murdered and her sister's trying to find out why. It's much more plausible to have a son who gets himself into some serious trouble and you're his father and you're trying to save him. And those stories can be just as big and just as powerful and just as important. But, you know, even now after 7 books, I have to go through that process.